We've got big news in the DB Cooper world, so let's get right to it. Hey friends, how you doing? Eric Eulis here. You know what? Today I've got something very big, so let's just jump right into it. So for the last while, I've been doing a deep dive, taking a deep dive into the particles that were found upon DB Cooper's clip-on tie. This is the clip-on tie that DB Cooper left behind on the jet after he jumped from the jet mid-flight, of course. Now, these particles were submitted to a company in Chicago called Macron Associates, and these guys are world famous. And what they did is they put these particles underneath an electron microscope. This took place in 2017, and they identified something north of 100,000 particles that came from DB Cooper's tie. Now, what makes these particles unique, and this is really pretty evident as I've analyzed this cold hard objective data here, is that these particles are consistent with basically a specialty metals environment. In other words, there's titanium, there's stainless steel, there are a whole variety of other metals and other alloys. And what makes them special is they appear to be consistent with the aerospace industry, the high-tech electronics industry, chemical industry, and so forth. And that's unusual because the broad array of particles that were found on DB Cooper's tie are not the kind of things you're just going to pick up walking around town, if you will, or frankly walking around your office environment, or at least a normal office environment. You wouldn't come across these things in 2022 very easily, not to mention the mid-1960s, which is when in all likelihood DB Cooper was wearing that clip-on tie. So what I've been looking for is something very specific. I've been trying to determine if there is a specific particle, a specific alloy that can point me to a specific company. I refer to this as almost like commercial DNA, if you will. Just as human DNA points to a specific individual, commercial DNA can point to a specific company. And I believe I have found it. One of the things I discovered was a very unique alloy, and it's an alloy that involves commercially pure titanium and an element called antimony. And specifically, there's a very specific blend, chemical blend of these two particles, or these two elements, if you will. Why this is important is because I happened to come across a patent related to what appears to be this very specific alloy, this commercially pure titanium and antimony alloy, of the proper percentages that we're looking for, the proper chemical balance, if you will. Again, talking about that commercial DNA. And this particular patent was granted to a company called Macron Titanium in the 1950s. Macron was a company that existed for a short number of years in the 1950s before it was bought out by a company called Crucible Steel, which is now Crucible Industries. Headquartered, or at least Macron is headquartered in Midland, Pennsylvania, which is just northwest of Pittsburgh, right along the Ohio River there, which is where, frankly, a lot of this kind of stuff takes place. Now, interestingly, I have been unable to find any commercial use of this particular alloy. So it appears to me that this particular alloy was just something that was created at that company, obviously something that was patented as well, and the patent expired in 1974. So this is beyond DB Cooper's jump. So again, I've never been able to find a commercial application for this particular alloy, and it doesn't appear that it was ever commercially disseminated. So what that tells us is that DB Cooper having a few particles of this specific alloy on his tie appears to indicate that DB Cooper was at this specific company and came across this specific alloy and managed to get a few particles of it on his tie. Now, the thing that's fascinating to consider here is that this patent was granted in the mid-1950s, and it doesn't appear again that it was ever commercially manufactured. So the question then becomes, how is it that D.B. Cooper came across this particular alloy in the, let's say, mid-1960s, when he would have been wearing the tie, when this stuff was actually created several years earlier in the mid-1950s? And I don't have an easy explanation for that, other than to say perhaps the company continued to do experimentation with this particular alloy, or perhaps they just had a stock of this alloy around the company and D.B. Cooper happened to come into contact with this at some point in time. This is obviously critically important because to me it does appear that D.B. Cooper was at this specific company, again formerly called Rem Crew, but eventually purchased by a company in 1968, I believe, or actually, come to think of it, it was not 1968, it was earlier than that, so, let's mark out 1968 here, but by a company called Crucible Steel, and it's now called Crucible Industries, and these people are still around today. So it's a fascinating thing to consider. Now, I did speak with Tom Kay about this, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with Tom Kay is a scientist who is well known in the D.B. Cooper world. And Tom did point out that perhaps what we're looking at here is actually commercially pure titanium that is actually plated with antimony. I don't think that's the case in this particular incident here, and the reason why is because I just haven't found any examples of that type of thing out there. Again, commercially pure titanium plated than antimony. And the other thing is that the chemical balance of the alloy is very specific and it fits right in with the patent. So that would just be one hell of a coincidence if it just happened to even out. So I think it's clear in my mind that we're dealing with an actual alloy here. The other important thing to note here is that we're dealing with actual metal. This isn't, oxide or something of that nature. And the reason we know this, or the reason I know this, is I can look at the chemical balance and see what the oxygen signature is in these particular particles, and there isn't an oxygen signature. So what that tells me, what that tells us, is we're dealing with actual metal here, with an actual metal alloy. So I believe firmly that this may well be the single biggest discovery, frankly, in the D.B. Cooper universe in several years, if not ever, because this does appear to point to a specific company for this particular alloy, and apparently D.B. Cooper was at this specific company at some moment in time, apparently in the 1960s, when he was wearing that clip-on tie. All right, folks, that's what I have for you today. Very exciting, very big development. I have a feeling that we are going to figure out who this guy was sooner rather than later. It's just a matter of time. We're zeroing in on this guy. I mean, if we're to the point we've actually identified a specific company and a specific time frame, D.B. Cooper's days are numbered as far as that goes. All right, again, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, folks, as always, cheers.